her debt to the underworld. Livia Romano had been raised like royalty, meant for a throne built on blood. But when her father was betrayed, when his empire fell overnight, she learned that power did not mean protection. She had spent a year in hiding, and now he had found her. Raphael Benedetti leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You look good for a dead woman," he murmured. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Palazzo Romano. The chipped ceramic mug warmed Livia's hands, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled deep in her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the damp October air seeping through the ill-fitting window of her tiny apartment. Florence was a city of vibrant life, a kaleidoscope of terracotta rooftops and echoing church bells, but Livia felt like a ghost, a faded specter haunting the edges of a world that had once been hers. 1 year. 1 year since the whispers had started, the hurried phone calls, the fear that had tightened her father's jaw, turning his usually jovial face into a granite mask. 1 year since the night the music died. She sipped the lukewarm chamomile tea, the floral scent doing little to soothe the persistent knot of anxiety in her stomach. The memory, sharp and unforgiving, played on repeat in her mind. The grand ballroom of Palazzo Romano, their ancestral home in Rome, shimmering with candlelight and the laughter of Rome's elite. Her father, Don Alessandro Romano, holding court, his hand resting lightly on her mother's shoulder. Livia, in a gown of emerald silk, feeling like a princess in a fairy tale. Then, the sudden silence, the screams, the crimson stain blooming on her father's white shirt. The chaos that followed was a blur. Her mother's frantic whispers, the loyal guards who had spirited her away, the network of hushed contacts that had led her to this anonymous existence in Florence. She'd traded silk for faded cotton, diamonds for chipped porcelain, a life of opulent security for one of constant fear. She had become Olivia Rossi, a quiet, unassuming art restorer, blending into the background, her past a carefully constructed lie. The reflection staring back at her from the darkened window pane was a stranger. The vibrant, confident Livia Romano, heiress to a powerful empire, had been replaced by this pale, haunted woman. Her dark hair, once meticulously styled, was now pulled back in a severe braid. The hollows beneath her cheekbones spoke of sleepless nights and meager meals. Only her eyes, a deep, luminous brown, retained a flicker of the fire that had once defined her. A sudden, sharp rap at the door sent a jolt of terror through her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She set the mug down with a trembling hand, the ceramic clattering against the worn wooden table. Who could it be? Her carefully constructed routine allowed for no visitors. The landlord? Unlikely. He usually left the rent notice under the door. The police? Had her fabricated past finally crumbled? She crept towards the door, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. Peering through the peephole, she saw a figure shrouded in the dim hallway light. Tall, broad-shouldered, a silhouette that exuded an aura of power and something else. Something dangerous. She couldn't see his face, but a primal instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. Another knock, more insistent this time. A voice, low and resonant, cut through the silence.
Livia Romano.
"I know you're in there." Her breath hitched. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, laced with a chilling certainty. He knew. He knew who she was, who she had been. The carefully constructed walls of her anonymity crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at her to remain silent, to pretend she wasn't there. But a flicker of defiance, a spark of the old Livia, ignited within her. She had been running for a year, living in the shadows. Perhaps it was time to face the darkness, to confront whatever ghost from her past had come to haunt her. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and slowly opened the door. Raphael Benedetti leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The dim light caught the hard angles of his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the glint of something cold and calculating in his dark eyes. He was even more imposing up close, a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, the dark fabric emphasizing his powerful physique. The scent of expensive cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and something darker, something untamed, mingled with the musty air of the hallway. A faint scar bisected his left eyebrow, a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. He was undeniably handsome, in a dangerous, unsettling way. "You look good for a dead woman," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the voice of a man used to command, used to obedience. And yet, there was a hint of something else in his tone, a flicker of amusement? Or perhaps it was merely the cruel satisfaction of a hunter who had finally found his quarry. Livia lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a forced calmness she didn't feel. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart continued its frantic rhythm. She knew, of course. The name Benedetti was synonymous with power, with ruthlessness, with a legacy even more ancient and formidable than her own. They were rivals, enemies, their families locked in a bitter feud that stretched back generations. He smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Raphael Benedetti. Surely, the name rings a bell. Principessa?" He used the title with a deliberate emphasis, a mocking reminder of what she had lost. "I don't know what you're talking about," Livia lied, her voice betraying a tremor she couldn't control. She kept her eyes locked on his, determined not to show any weakness, though her legs trembled beneath her. Raphael's smile widened, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. "Don't insult my intelligence, Livia. We both know who you are, and we both know why I'm here." He pushed himself off the doorframe, taking a step closer. Livia instinctively recoiled, the small space of the hallway suddenly feeling claustrophobic. "I have nothing to say to you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to get away, to disappear again. But where could she go? He had found her here, in this obscure corner of Florence. He would find her anywhere. He took another step, his presence filling the narrow hallway, leaving her no room to escape. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the intoxicating scent of his cologne. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face. Livia flinched, expecting a blow, a threat. Instead, his fingers brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, a gesture so unexpectedly gentle, so at odds with the menace in his eyes, that it took her breath away. "You have your father's eyes," he said, his voice softer now, almost wistful. The unexpected tenderness, the flicker of vulnerability in his gaze, disarmed her. For a moment, the fear receded, replaced by a strange, unsettling curiosity. What did he want? Why had he come? Was this a prelude to violence, or something else entirely? The questions swirled in her mind, a chaotic storm of doubt and apprehension. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of his true intentions. But his expression was a mask, carefully guarded, revealing nothing. He lowered his hand, the brief moment of contact broken. The coldness returned to his eyes, the predatory gleam replacing the fleeting softness. "We have much to discuss, Livia. About your father, about your inheritance, and about the choices you're going to have to make." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the threadbare apartment, the worn furniture, the palpable fear in her eyes. "You can't hide forever, Principessa. The past has a way of catching up with us all." He stepped back, creating a sliver of space between them, a small reprieve. "I'll give you tonight to think. Tomorrow I'll come for you." And the promise, the unsaid threat, hanged heavy between them, like a waiting storm. Chapter 2. A serpent's unexpected courtesy. The morning light, pale and weak, filtered through the grimy windowpane, painting dust motes dancing in the air. Livia hadn't slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, had sent jolts of adrenaline through her exhausted body. Raphael Benedetti's words echoed in her mind, a relentless mantra of fear and uncertainty. "Tomorrow, I'll come for you." She had spent the night pacing the confines of her small apartment, replaying the encounter, searching for any hidden meaning, any clue to his true intentions. His unexpected gentleness, the fleeting vulnerability in his eyes when he spoke of her father, had thrown her off balance. It didn't fit the image she had cultivated of the Benedettis' ruthless, cold-blooded, enemies of her family for generations. She hugged herself, trying to ward off the chill that had settled deep within her. The scent of chamomile tea, now cold and stale, still lingered in the air, a mocking reminder of her futile attempts to find calm. She had considered running, disappearing again, changing her identity once more. But a weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion, held her back. She was tired of running, tired of living in fear. And a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time, stirred within her. Curiosity. What did he mean by her inheritance? The Romano Empire had crumbled, its assets seized, its power extinguished. There was nothing left. Or was there? Her father had always been secretive, a master of hidden deals and clandestine alliances. Could he have hidden something the Benedettis now sought? The thought sparked a flicker of hope, a fragile ember in the ashes of her despair. Perhaps there was a way out, a way to reclaim some semblance of her former life. But that hope was intertwined with a profound sense of dread. Dealing with Raphael Benedetti was like playing with fire, a dangerous game with potentially devastating consequences. She dressed in the plainest clothes she owned, a faded gray dress and a worn cardigan, hoping to blend into the background, to appear as insignificant as possible. She braided her hair tightly, trying to tame the unruly curls that seemed to betray her inner turmoil. She looked in the mirror, her reflection still a stranger, but there was a new determination in her eyes, a flicker of defiance that hadn't been there yesterday. She made a pot of strong coffee, the bitter aroma filling the small apartment, a temporary distraction from the gnawing anxiety in her stomach. She needed to be alert, to be prepared for whatever Raphael Benedetti had planned. She had no illusions about his courtesy. He was a serpent, offering a moment of respite before striking. The knock came precisely at noon. Livia's heart jumped into her throat, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, to compose her features into a mask of calm indifference. She opened the door, bracing herself for the confrontation. Raphael Benedetti stood on the landing, as imposing as she remembered, dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, this one a deep shade of charcoal gray. He held a small, white box in his hands. He didn't smile, but his eyes, dark and unfathomable, held a hint of something that might have been respect. "Good morning, Livia," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I trust you've had time to consider my proposition." "I don't know what proposition you're referring to," Livia replied, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. She refused to give him the satisfaction of acknowledging her fear. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Don't play coy with me, Principessa. We both know you understand the situation perfectly." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her plain attire, her guarded expression. "I brought you something." He extended the white box towards her. Livia hesitated, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. What was this? A bribe? A threat? She cautiously took the box, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm, surprisingly so, and the brief contact sent a jolt of unexpected awareness through her. She opened the box, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of crimson velvet, lay a single, perfect white rose. Its petals were flawless, its scent delicate and intoxicating. It was a gesture so unexpected, so incongruous with the image of the ruthless Benedetti heir, that it left her speechless. "A peace offering," Raphael said, his voice soft, almost gentle, "and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, beauty can still exist." Livia looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. But his expression was unreadable, a carefully crafted mask. What was his game? Why this sudden display of kindness? Was it a genuine gesture, or a calculated move to disarm her, to lower her defenses? "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small space of the doorway. "I know this is difficult for you," he said, his voice low and resonant. "But I'm not your enemy, Livia. Not necessarily." His words, his proximity, the unexpected scent of his cologne, created a strange vortex of confusion and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to attraction. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling she thought had been buried along with her past. "Then what are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, but he didn't touch her. "Perhaps an ally," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "Someone who can help you reclaim what is rightfully yours." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "But it will require trust, Livia. And trust is a precious commodity in our world." His words hung in the air, a challenge, a promise, a threat, all intertwined. The white rose, a symbol of peace, of beauty, of innocence, felt heavy in her hands, a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded them. She looked from the rose to Raphael's face, her mind racing, trying to decipher his true intentions. Could she trust him? Could she afford not to trust him? He was her only hope, a dangerous, unpredictable lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. "What do you want from me?" she finally asks, feeling the question pulled from the deepest recess of her fears. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. But the absence didn't detract from it. It simply added a different layer, something akin to understanding. "Only your cooperation, Principessa. For now." And in his tone, she recognizes the subtle shift and the implicit warning that for now could very easily change. Chapter 3. Echoes of betrayal in the rain. The rain started as a soft drizzle, a delicate veil over Florence's already muted colors. It mirrored the unease that had settled over Livia, a persistent hum beneath the fragile truce she'd seemingly struck with Raphael Benedetti. He had left her with the white rose, the cryptic promise of cooperation, and a scheduled meeting for later that evening. He hadn't specified where, only that he would send a car. She had spent the afternoon in a state of restless agitation. The rose, now sitting in a small glass of water on her windowsill, seemed to mock her with its pristine beauty. It was a symbol of a world she no longer belonged to, a world of elegance and ease, a world shattered by betrayal. The betrayal. That was the core of her fear, the festering wound that refused to heal. Her father's death hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated, a carefully planned execution carried out by someone he had trusted. Someone within his inner circle. The whispers she'd overheard in the frantic hours before her escape had pointed to a rival family, a long-standing feud simmering beneath the surface of polite society. The Benedettis. But Raphael's demeanor, his unexpected courtesy, his claim of not being her necessary enemy, had planted a seed of doubt. Could he be telling the truth? Could the Benedettis have been framed? Or was this a more elaborate, more insidious form of betrayal, a slow, deliberate seduction designed to lure her into a trap? She paced the small apartment, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards a counterpoint to the drumming of the rain against the window pane. She replayed every detail of their two encounters, searching for any inconsistency, any flicker of deceit. His eyes, dark and intense, had held a strange mixture of hardness and something else. Something that resonated with a loneliness she understood all too well. She stopped by the window, watching the rain wash over the city, blurring the edges of the buildings, turning the cobblestone streets into shimmering rivers. The reflection staring back at her was no longer the frightened ghost of yesterday. There was a flicker of steel in her eyes, a renewed sense of purpose. She would play his game, for now. She would listen, she would observe, and she would uncover the truth, whatever it may be. As dusk began to settle, the rain intensified, transforming into a torrential downpour. The city lights blurred into hazy halos, reflecting in the slick streets. A black car, sleek and imposing, pulled up in front of her building, its headlights cutting through the gloom. A uniformed driver, his face impassible, emerged, holding a large black umbrella. "Signorina Rossi?" he asked, his voice polite but devoid of warmth. It was a formality, a confirmation, not a question. Livia nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs. She took a deep breath, pulling on a worn raincoat, the thin fabric offering little protection against the driving rain. She stepped out into the storm, the cold rain instantly plastering her hair to her forehead. The driver opened the car door, ushering her inside. The interior was plush and luxurious, a stark contrast to her humble surroundings. The scent of leather and a faint hint of Raphael's cologne filled the air, a subtle reminder of his presence, his power. The car glided silently through the rain-slicked streets, the wipers working furiously to clear the windshield. Livia sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the blurred cityscape rushing past. She had no idea where they were going, what awaited her. She was completely at Raphael's mercy, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The car finally pulled up in front of a nondescript building in a quiet, residential neighborhood. It looked like an ordinary apartment building, unremarkable in every way. But Livia knew better. Nothing about Raphael Benedetti was ordinary. The driver escorted her through a dimly lit lobby, up a flight of stairs, and down a long corridor. He stopped in front of an unmarked door, knocked twice, and then stepped back, his face expressionless. The door opened, revealing a surprisingly opulent apartment. The contrast to the building's exterior was jarring. Soft lighting, rich fabrics, antique furniture, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. It was a haven of warmth and elegance, a world away from the storm raging outside. Raphael Benedetti stood by a large window, looking out at the rain-swept city. He turned as she entered, his dark eyes taking in her appearance, her damp raincoat, the strands of hair clinging to her cheeks. He didn't smile, but his gaze softened slightly. "You made it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was beginning to think you might have changed your mind." "I considered it," Livia admitted, her voice steady, though her heart still raced. She walked further into the room, her eyes scanning the surroundings, searching for any sign of danger, any hint of his true intentions. He gestured towards a comfortable-looking armchair near a fireplace, where a small fire crackled merrily. "Please sit down. You must be cold." Livia hesitated, then cautiously sat down, her back straight, her hands still clasped tightly in her lap. The warmth of the fire was welcome, but it did little to ease the tension that coiled within her. Raphael poured 2 cups of coffee from a silver pot on a nearby table. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance," he said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. "But discretion is paramount in my world." Livia took a sip of the coffee, the strong, bitter brew a welcome shock to her senses. "Why am I here, Raphael?" she asked, her voice direct, her gaze unwavering. She was done with the games, the subtle hints, the veiled threats. She needed answers. He sat down in the armchair opposite her, his dark eyes studying her intently. "I told you," he said, his voice low and serious. "I believe we can help each other." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "I know who killed your father, Livia. And it wasn't who you think." The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. It was the truth, unvarnished and terrible, the truth that, despite all her maneuvering, had found her. And now, staring across the room, she could feel the weight of all that was coming bearing down. Chapter 4. The Weight of Benedetti Eyes. The fire crackled, a counterpoint to the silence that stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations and years of ingrained distrust. Livia set her coffee cup down, the delicate china clinking against the saucer, a sound that seemed amplified in the quiet room. "Who?" she asked, the word a raw whisper, her voice tight with a mixture of dread and a desperate, fragile hope. Raphael leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. The firelight played across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the intensity of his dark eyes. He looked like a predator poised to strike, yet there was a vulnerability in his gaze, a weariness that hinted at a burden he carried. The Morettis, he said, the name a low growl, laced with a venom that surprised her. The Morettis were another powerful family, their influence woven into the fabric of Roman society. But they weren't known enemies of the Romanos. They were associates, business partners, even friends. Livia shook her head, disbelief warring with a growing sense of unease. That's impossible. My father trusted Marco Moretti. She struggled to find the right word. The memory of their fathers laughing together, sharing meals, sealing deals, flashing before her eyes. Like brothers. Raphael's expression hardened. Trust is a dangerous illusion, Livia. Especially in our world. Your father was naive to believe in it. His words struck a nerve, a raw, exposed wound. My father was a good man, she retorted, her voice rising. He was honorable, loyal. He was dead, Raphael interrupted, his voice sharp, cutting her off. And his honor and loyalty didn't protect him. They made him a target. Livia flinched, his bluntness a slap in the face. She knew he was right in a way. Her father's unwavering belief in the old codes, in the sanctity of family and loyalty, had blinded him to the treachery that surrounded him. But it was a bitter pill to swallow, especially coming from a Benedetti. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What do you gain by revealing this truth? He leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. The Morettis have grown too powerful. They've upset the balance. They're a threat, not just to me, but to everyone who operates within the established order. He paused, his eyes searching hers. Your father's death was a message, a warning. They wanted to eliminate a potential rival, to consolidate their power. And you want to retaliate? Livia asked, her mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle, to understand the complex web of alliances and rivalries that governed their world. Raphael smiled, a slow, chilling curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. Retaliation is crude. I prefer justice. A more nuanced approach. And what does that involve? Livia asked, her voice trembling slightly. She felt like a pawn being moved across a chessboard, her fate determined by forces she couldn't control. He stood up, walking over to the window, his back to her. It was about information, leverage, power. And she was the key to unlocking it. And you believe I know where it is? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned, his dark eyes locking with hers. Your father trusted you implicitly. He wouldn't have left such a crucial piece of evidence in anyone else's hands. Livia shook her head. I don't know anything about any document. She was telling the truth, as far as she knew. Her father had never confided in her about his business dealings, shielding her from the darker aspects of their world. Raphael studied her intently, his gaze piercing, searching for any sign of deception. The weight of his scrutiny was almost unbearable, a physical pressure that made it difficult to breathe. She felt exposed, vulnerable, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under his relentless gaze. Perhaps, he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. Or perhaps you've simply forgotten. Trauma can do strange things to the memory. He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. But I believe it's in there, Olivia. Locked away, waiting to be rediscovered. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, his fingers brushing against her cheek. The unexpected touch sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to desire. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, a feeling she thought had been extinguished along with her past. I will help you remember, he said, his voice a husky murmur, his breath warm against her skin. And together, we will bring the Morettis down. His eyes held a promise, a threat, a challenge, all intertwined. It was a promise that would change everything, a descent into a world of shadows and betrayal, a world where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. And the most terrifying, enthralling thing was how little choice she seemed to have. She knew, with a deep-seated certainty, that the path forward was laden with perils. But turning away now wasn't an option. The seed, once planted, had begun to take root. He removed his hand, The sudden emptiness a stark contrast to the lingering warmth. Think about it, Livia. Think hard. Your father's legacy, your future, depends on it. He turned to pour them both more coffee, the clinking of the glass a quiet disruption to the heavy promise. Chapter 5. An unsavory proposition, a glimmer of hope. The aroma of coffee, rich and dark, filled the air, a fragile attempt at normalcy in a situation that was anything but. Livia accepted the cup from Raphael, her fingers brushing against his, the brief contact sending another unexpected jolt through her. She took a sip, the hot liquid a welcome distraction from the turmoil of emotions swirling within her. You make it sound so simple, she said, her voice laced with a bitterness she couldn't quite conceal. Find a document I don't even know exists, and then what? Hand it over to you? Trust you to use it for justice? Raphael sat down opposite her, his dark eyes studying her intently. It's not simple, Livia. I'm not asking you to blindly trust me. I'm asking you to consider the alternative. The alternative. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Remaining a ghost, living in fear, forever looking over her shoulder. Or worse, falling victim to the Moretus, the very people who had orchestrated her father's death. What's in this document? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What makes it so valuable? Raphael hesitated, his gaze flickering away for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. It's proof of a betrayal, he said, his voice low and tight. A betrayal that goes far beyond your father's murder. A betrayal that implicates the Moretus in dealings with unsavory elements. Elements that threaten the stability of our entire world. Livia frowned, trying to understand the implications. What kind of dealings? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. The Moretus have been expanding their influence beyond the traditional boundaries. They've been making alliances with outsiders. People who don't respect our codes, our traditions. He paused, his gaze locking with hers. They're playing a dangerous game, Livia. And they're willing to sacrifice anyone who gets in their way. His words painted a picture far more complex and dangerous than she had initially imagined. It wasn't just about a family feud, a personal vendetta. It was about a power struggle that threatened to destabilize the entire underworld, a conflict that could have far-reaching consequences. And you believe this document will stop them? She asked, her voice skeptical. Raphael smiled, a slow, chilling curve of his lips. It will expose them. It will strip them of their legitimacy, their power. It will make them vulnerable. And what about me? Livia asked, her voice trembling slightly. What happens to me after I give you this document? He reached out, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, surprisingly comforting, and it sent a wave of unexpected sensation through her. You'll be safe, he said, his voice soft, almost reassuring. I'll protect you. I give you my word. His word. The word of a Benedetti. Could she trust it? Could she trust him? He was a dangerous man, a predator, a product of a world where violence and betrayal were commonplace. And yet, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of sincerity, a hint of vulnerability, that made her want to believe him. I need time, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Time to think, to search my memories. He nodded, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer before he withdrew it. I understand. But time is a luxury we don't have in abundance. The Moretus are not idle. They're searching for this document as well. And they won't hesitate to eliminate any potential threats. The threat was implicit, a chilling reminder of the danger she was in. She was caught between two powerful forces, two ruthless families, each vying for control. And she was the key, the pawn, the potential victim. I'll give you until the end of the week, Raphael said, his voice firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Then I'll need an answer. He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. My driver will take you back. Livia rose, her legs feeling unsteady. She felt drained, exhausted, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had a choice to make, a decision that would determine her future, her survival. Trust Raphael Benedetti, a man she barely knew, a man from a family she had been taught to despise. Or remain a ghost, forever haunted by the past, forever vulnerable to the machinations of her enemies. As she walked towards the door, Raphael spoke again, his voice low and resonant. "Livia," he said, his tone making her stop and turn. He met her eyes. "Remember this. My offer of help does not stem from a kind heart. This is for survival, for both of us. But you surviving, that is what matters most. And you will." The rain had stopped. The streets were still wet, reflecting the city lights in shimmering pools. As the car glided silently through the night, Livia stared out the window, her mind racing. Raphael's words echoed in her mind, a mixture of threat and promise, a dangerous gamble with potentially devastating consequences. But amidst the fear and uncertainty, a flicker of hope had been ignited. A hope for justice, for retribution, for a chance to reclaim a piece of the life that had been stolen from her. And as she pondered his final words, there was a quiet resolve strengthening within her. Chapter 6. Scars Beneath the Silk. The week passed in a blur of restless nights and fragmented memories. Livia spent hours poring over old photographs, letters, any memento from her past that might trigger a recollection, a clue to the mysterious document Raphael spoke of. She revisited her childhood home in her mind, walking through the familiar rooms, searching for any hidden compartment, any secret drawer, any sign that her father had left something behind for her. But the memories were elusive, shrouded in a haze of trauma and grief. The night of the attack had fractured her mind, leaving behind a jumble of disconnected images, sounds, and emotions. She could recall the fear, the chaos, the blood, but the details, the specific moments that might hold the key to the document, remained just out of reach. She found herself thinking about Raphael constantly. His image, his voice, his touch, lingered in her mind, a persistent presence that both intrigued and unsettled her. She replayed their conversations, searching for any hidden meaning, any clue to his true intentions. He was a dangerous man, she knew, but there was something about him, a vulnerability beneath the hard exterior, that drew her in. One evening, while sifting through a box of old jewelry, she found a small, intricately carved wooden box she didn't recognize. It was locked, and she couldn't find a key. Her heart quickened. Could this be it? Could this be the hiding place her father had chosen? She tried to force the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she threw the box back into the larger container, the sound echoing in the quiet apartment. She buried her face in her hands, despair threatening to overwhelm her. She was running out of time. Raphael's deadline loomed, and she was no closer to finding the document than she had been a week ago. A sudden knock at the door startled her. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, she crept towards the door, peering through the peephole. Raphael stood on the landing, his face in shadow, his expression unreadable. He wasn't dressed in his usual impeccable suit. He wore dark jeans and a black leather jacket, making him look even more imposing, more dangerous. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She wasn't ready to face him, to admit her failure. But she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. She took a deep breath and opened the door. "Raphael," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Livia," he replied, his voice low and resonant. His eyes scanned her face, taking in her pale complexion, the dark circles under her eyes. "You look tired." "I haven't been sleeping well," she admitted, stepping back to allow him to enter. He walked into the apartment, his presence filling the small space. His gaze swept over the room, taking in the scattered photographs, the open boxes, the evidence of her frantic search. "Have you found anything?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Livia shook her head, her shoulders slumping with defeat. "Nothing. I don't know where it is. I don't even know if it exists." He turned to face her, his eyes dark and intense. "It exists, Livia. I know it does." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "Tell me about your father. Tell me about your life before everything changed." She hesitated, unsure where to begin. The memories were painful, a bittersweet reminder of a life she could never reclaim. But she knew she had to try. She had to trust him, at least to a point. She began to talk, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. She told him about her childhood, about her loving parents, about the grand Palazzo Romano, about the laughter and the music and the sense of security that had been shattered in a single night. As she spoke, she noticed a change in Raphael's demeanor. He listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. He asked questions, probing, insightful questions that helped her to unlock memories she thought she had lost forever. He asked about her father's study, his habits, his secret places. He asked about her mother, her relationship with her father, any unusual events leading up to the attack. As she talked, a memory surfaced, a fleeting image of her father placing something inside a hidden compartment behind a painting in his study. A painting of a white rose. Her breath caught in her throat. The painting, she whispered, her eyes widening. There was a painting, a white rose in my father's study. There was a secret compartment behind it. Raphael's eyes lit up, a flicker of triumph in their depths. Describe the painting, he said, his voice urgent. Livia closed her eyes, trying to visualize the image. It was large, almost life-sized. A single white rose, its petals slightly unfurled, a drop of dew clinging to one of them. It was exquisite. And the compartment? He asked, his voice a low murmur. I don't remember exactly how it opened, but I remember my father showing it to me once, when I was a little girl. He told me it was a secret just between us. Raphael reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. You're remembering, he said, his voice soft, encouraging. Keep going. As she continued to talk, more memories surfaced, fragments of conversations, glimpses of hidden objects, pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. The scars of the past were still there, raw and painful, but beneath them, a glimmer of hope began to shine. The act of unearthing those memories, it felt, to Livia, as if his very presence was a balm. She glanced at him, for just a moment, and saw the soft empathy. It was gone as quick as it had appeared, but it had been there, and it was that which propelled her forward. She knew now, beyond any doubt, the painting held her answers. He squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. We're close. I can feel it. Chapter 7. Whispers of the Fallen Empire. The Palazzo Romano stood silhouetted against the night sky, a hulking, imposing structure that exuded an aura of faded grandeur and lingering secrets. It had been a year since Livia had last set foot within its walls, a year since her life had been irrevocably shattered. Returning now, under the cover of darkness, with Raphael Benedetti at her side, felt like stepping back into a dream, a haunting, bittersweet memory. The palazzo was officially under the control of the state, seized after her father's death, its future uncertain. But Raphael, with his connections and influence, had managed to secure access, bypassing the official channels, navigating the murky waters of Roman bureaucracy with an ease that both impressed and unnerved Livia. The rain had returned, a soft, persistent drizzle that mirrored the melancholic atmosphere. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a poignant reminder of the passage of time, of the irreversible changes that had swept through her life. Raphael had arranged for a discreet entry, avoiding the main gates, using a side entrance that led through the overgrown gardens. The once meticulously manicured lawns and flower beds were now wild and untamed, a reflection of the neglect and decay that had befallen the Romano Empire. As they walked through the darkened gardens, Livia felt a pang of sadness, a deep ache for the lost beauty, the lost innocence of her childhood. She remembered running through these very gardens, playing hide and seek with her cousins, her laughter echoing through the air. Now, only silence reigned, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the soft patter of rain. Raphael walked beside her, his presence a silent reassurance, a shield against the ghosts of the past. He didn't speak, but his hand brushed against hers occasionally, a subtle gesture of support that sent a wave of unexpected warmth through her. They reached the side entrance, a heavy wooden door hidden behind a thicket of overgrown ivy. Raphael produced a key, the metal clicking softly in the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was thick with a scent of dust and decay, a poignant reminder of the palazzo's abandonment. Moonlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the marble floors. Livia felt a shiver run down her spine, a sense of unease settling over her. "Stay close," Raphael murmured, his voice low and cautious. He pulled a small, powerful flashlight from his pocket, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. They moved slowly through the silent hallways, their footsteps echoing eerily in the vast emptiness. Livia recognized the familiar layout, the grand staircase, the ornate chandeliers, the portraits of her ancestors lining the walls. But everything felt different, alien, imbued with a sense of sadness and loss. They reached her father's study, the room where the painting, the potential key to her salvation, awaited. The door was locked, but Raphael quickly bypassed it, his skills honed by a lifetime of navigating the shadows. The study was as she remembered it, a large, opulent room filled with heavy mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and the lingering scent of her father's favorite pipe tobacco. The moonlight illuminated the painting on the far wall, the white rose seeming to glow in the darkness, a beacon of hope amidst the surrounding gloom. Livia felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She moved towards the painting, her heart pounding in her chest. Raphael stayed close behind her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a silent source of strength. She reached out, her fingers tracing the outline of the rose, the familiar texture of the canvas bringing back a flood of memories. She remembered her father showing her the secret compartment, his voice a low whisper, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "It's a secret, Livia," he had said. "Just between us." She closed her eyes, trying to recall the mechanism, the specific movement that would unlock the hidden compartment. She remembered a slight pressure, a subtle click, a sliding panel. She pressed her fingers against the canvas, feeling for a hidden latch, a subtle indentation. She moved her hand slowly, methodically, exploring every inch of the painting's surface. Suddenly she felt it. A slight give, a subtle click. Her heart leaped with excitement. She pressed harder, and a small section of the canvas slid inward, revealing a hidden compartment behind the painting. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against a smooth, cool object. She pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat. It was a small, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with the Romano family crest. Raphael stepped beside her, shining his flashlight. He looked to her. The faintest smile was on his lips. "Open it," he said simply, quietly. And it was that quiet support that steadied her. The air between them was thick with the sense of something monumental. The weight of her father's secrets, and, perhaps, her own salvation, lay within its pages. And it felt like her entire past and uncertain future were pressing on her as she did. Chapter 8. A dance of shadows and suspicion. Livia's hands trembled as she opened the leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. It was a journal, filled with her father's elegant, cursive handwriting. He had documented everything, his business dealings, his alliances, his suspicions, his fears. As she began to read, a chilling picture emerged. Her father had been aware of the Morettis' treachery, their growing ambition, their willingness to break the established codes. He had documented their illegal activities, their alliances with dangerous outsiders, their plans to consolidate their power. The document Raphael saw wasn't a single contract, but a series of entries, spread throughout the journal, detailing a complex web of deceit and betrayal. Her father had meticulously gathered evidence, preparing to expose the Morettis, to bring them down. But he had been betrayed before he could act. Livia felt a wave of grief and anger wash over her. Her father had been a good man, an honorable man, caught in a web of treachery he couldn't escape. And she, his daughter, had been living in ignorance, unaware of the forces that had destroyed their lives. Raphael stood beside her, reading over her shoulder, his presence a silent source of strength. He pointed to specific entries, highlighting key names, dates, transactions. He knew the players, the intricate network of alliances and rivalries that defined their world. "This is it," he said, his voice low and tight. "This is what we need. This is enough to expose the Moretus, to destroy them." But as Livia continued to read, she discovered something else, something that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. Her father had also documented his suspicions about someone within his own inner circle, someone he believed was feeding information to the Moretus. He hadn't named names, but he had left clues, subtle hints, cryptic references. And those clues pointed to someone Livia had trusted, someone she had considered a friend. Someone close to Raphael Benedetti. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "There's something else," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My father believed there was a traitor, someone working with the Moretus, someone close to him." Raphael's expression hardened, his eyes darkening with a flicker of what? Anger? Fear? Betrayal? "Who?" he asked, his voice sharp, his gaze intense. Livia hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust him? Could she reveal her suspicions, knowing that they implicated someone close to him? She was walking a tightrope, balanced precariously between two dangerous forces. "I don't know for sure," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But there are clues, hints that point to someone within your circle." Raphael's jaw tightened, his hand clenching into a fist. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice a low growl. Livia took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She showed him the relevant entries, the cryptic references, the subtle hints her father had left behind. She explained her reasoning, her suspicions, her growing unease. As she spoke, Raphael's expression changed, shifting from anger to a cold, calculating calm. He listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face, his mind clearly racing, analyzing the information, piecing together the puzzle. "This changes things," he said, his voice low and tight. "This complicates the situation." "Who is it?" Livia asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Who do you think it is?" Raphael hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be weighing his words, considering the implications of his answer. "I have my suspicions," he said, his voice guarded. "But I need proof. I need to be certain." He closed the journal, his hand lingering on the cover, as if absorbing the weight of its secrets. "We need to be careful, Livia," he said, his voice low and serious. "We're dealing with dangerous people, and we can't trust anyone." His words sent a chill down her spine. She was surrounded by enemies, by potential betrayers. She didn't know who to trust, who to believe. She was caught in a web of deceit and suspicion, her every move fraught with danger. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked like admiration. "You're stronger than you think, Livia," he said, his voice soft, almost tender. "You have your father's courage, his intelligence. And you have me." His words, his presence, offered a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. But it was a fragile hope, a precarious alliance in a world where trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The dance of shadows and suspicion had begun, and she knew that one wrong step could lead to her downfall. The rain continued to fall outside, a fitting, somber background for the storm that was starting to take shape. Chapter 9. The Price of Protection, the Cost of Trust. The following days were a tense, uneasy dance of strategy and subterfuge. Raphael moved Livia from her small Florence apartment to a more secure location, a luxurious villa nestled in the Tuscan hills, owned by a trusted, or so he claimed, associate. The villa was beautiful, a haven of peace and tranquility, but Livia felt like a prisoner, albeit one in a gilded cage. She was surrounded by guards, silent, watchful men who followed her every move. She had no contact with the outside world, no phone, no internet, no way to communicate with anyone beyond the confines of the villa. Raphael was her only link to the outside, her protector, her captor, her potential betrayer. He visited her frequently, bringing news, updates, and a carefully curated version of the events unfolding in Rome. He told her that he was using her father's journal to expose the Morettus, to dismantle their network of power, to bring them to justice. But he was careful, methodical, revealing only what he deemed necessary, keeping her in the dark about the specifics of his plan. Livia spent her days reading, walking in the gardens, and trying to decipher the cryptic clues in her father's journal. She was determined to uncover the identity of the traitor, to understand the full extent of the betrayal that had destroyed her family. She replayed every conversation, every interaction she had had with Raphael's inner circle, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of ulterior motives. The most obvious suspect was Marco Rossi, Raphael's cousin and closest advisor. Livia remembered Marco from her childhood, a charming, charismatic man who had always been kind to her. But her father's journal hinted at a hidden darkness, a secret ambition that threatened to consume him. Another possibility was Isabella Conti, Raphael's longtime mistress, a beautiful, sophisticated woman with a sharp mind and a ruthless streak. Livia had met Isabella briefly at a social event years ago, and she had sensed a coldness beneath the surface, a calculating intelligence that made her uneasy. But Raphael himself remained an enigma. He was protective, almost possessive, of Livia, shielding her from the dangers of their world. He treated her with a respect, a tenderness, that belied his reputation as a ruthless, cold-blooded leader. And yet, there were moments when she saw a flicker of darkness in his eyes, a hint of the violence that lurked beneath the surface. One evening, Raphael arrived at the villa with news. He looked tired, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. But there was a flicker of triumph in his gaze. "The Morettus are crumbling," he said, his voice low and tight. "Their allies are abandoning them, their businesses are failing, their influence is waning." Livia felt a surge of satisfaction, a sense of justice being served. But it was a bittersweet victory, overshadowed by the loss of her father, the destruction of her family. "And the traitor?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Have you found them?" Raphael hesitated, his gaze flickering away for a moment. "I'm close," he said, his voice guarded. "I have my suspicions, but I need proof." He sat down beside her on a plush sofa, his presence filling the space, his warmth a welcome contrast to the chill that had settled over her. He reached out, his hand covering hers. "I know this is difficult, Livia," he said, his voice soft, almost tender. "But I promise you, I will protect you. I will bring them all to justice." His words, his touch, sent a wave of conflicting emotions through her. She wanted to trust him, to believe in his promise, but the doubts lingered, the whispers of suspicion refusing to be silenced. "What happens after?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What happens to me to us?" He turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. "That depends on you, Livia," he said, his voice a husky murmur. "On what you want." His proximity, the intensity of his gaze, the unspoken desires that simmered between them, created a vortex of confusion and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to love. It was a feeling she had tried to suppress, to deny, but it was growing stronger, more insistent, with each passing day. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, sending shivers down her spine. "You want to be safe," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You want to be free. And you want me." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of desire, of a connection that defied the boundaries of their dangerous world. But even as she surrendered to the moment, the nagging voice of reason lingered at the edges. He was, after all, everything she was raised to fear. But the price of safety, it was becoming clearer and clearer, was her heart. And the terrifying thing was, she wasn't so sure anymore that she wasn't ready to pay it. He pulled back just slightly. "Do you trust me, Livia?" He needed to know. And so did she. Chapter 10. Beneath the Surface of Civility. The question hung in the air, heavy and charged, a pivotal point in their fragile, complicated relationship. Do you trust me, Livia? Livia looked into Raphael's dark, intense eyes, searching for any hint of deception, any flicker of insincerity. But his gaze was unwavering, open, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. It was a simple question, but the answer was anything but trust. In their world, it was a rare and precious commodity, easily broken, almost impossible to repair. She had been raised to distrust the Benedettis, to view them as enemies, as ruthless predators. And yet, Raphael had protected her, sheltered her, offered her a chance at justice, at a new life. But the whispers of her father's journal, the clues pointing to a traitor within Raphael's inner circle, continued to haunt her. Could she truly trust him, knowing that someone close to him had betrayed her father? Could she risk her heart, her life, on a man who might be playing a deeper, more dangerous game? She began, her voice hesitant, her mind racing. She wanted to say yes, to surrender to the feelings that had been growing between them, to believe in his promise of protection, of a future together. But the doubts lingered, the seeds of suspicion planted by her father's words. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of doubt that clouded her expression. He didn't press her, didn't demand an answer. He simply waited, his gaze patient, understanding. I want to trust you, Raphael, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. But there are things I don't understand. He nodded, his hand still gently cupping her cheek. I know, he said, his voice soft, reassuring. And I will answer all your questions, Livia. I will tell you everything. He began to explain, slowly, methodically, unraveling the complex web of alliances and rivalries that define their world. He told her about his family's history, the long-standing feud with the Morettis, the constant struggle for power and control. He spoke of his own past, his upbringing, the expectations and responsibilities that had been thrust upon him from a young age. He revealed the darkness he had witnessed, the violence he had participated in, the sacrifices he had made to protect his family, his legacy. He didn't shy away from the difficult truths, the uncomfortable realities of his life. He admitted his mistakes, his regrets, his flaws. He showed her the scars, both physical and emotional, that he carried beneath the surface of civility, beneath the carefully constructed facade of power and control. As he spoke, Livia began to understand him, to see beyond the image of the ruthless Benedetti heir. She saw a man burdened by responsibility, haunted by the past, yearning for something more, something better. She saw a vulnerability, a loneliness that mirrored her own. He addressed the issue of the traitor, the suspicions that had been poisoning her trust. He acknowledged the clues in her father's journal, the evidence pointing to someone within his inner circle. I know you suspect Marco, he said, his voice tight, his gaze intense. And you have reason to. He's ambitious, he's ruthless, and he's always resented my position. But he also revealed another possibility, a name that Livia hadn't considered. Isabella Connie, his mistress. He explained that Isabella had a history of manipulating men, of using her beauty and intelligence to gain power and influence. She had been close to Marco Moretti before his death, a relationship that had always troubled Raphael. I don't know who it is, Livia, he admitted, his voice filled with a rare uncertainty. But I will find out. I will uncover the truth, no matter the cost. He reached out, taking both of her hands in his grip firm but gentle. I need your help, he said, his voice a low murmur. I need your insights, your intuition. You knew your father better than anyone. You can help me decipher the clues, to understand his suspicions. It was a plea, a request for partnership, a recognition of her strength, her intelligence. It was a step towards a deeper connection, a foundation of trust built on shared vulnerability and a common goal. I will help you, she said, her voice firm, her doubts receding, replaced by a growing sense of determination. She would work with him. She would trust him, at least for now. She would help him uncover the truth, and together, they would bring the traitor to justice. But in doing so, she would also listen to her instincts, to her father's warnings. He nodded, a small smile forming at her mouth. The trust, it seemed, was starting to go both ways. And the relief on his face, it was subtle, but it told her everything she needed to hear. "Then let us begin," he declared, "with dinner." And there, in the candlelight, there was the smallest step toward a future. Chapter 11. Cracks in the Benedetti Armor. The dinner was a carefully orchestrated affair, a display of normalcy in a world steeped in deception and danger. Raphael had arranged for a private chef to prepare a traditional Tuscan meal, a feast of local delicacies and fine wines. The dining room, with its long, polished table, flickering candles, and elegant tableware, felt like a stage set, a scene from a different life, a life Livia had almost forgotten. Raphael was the perfect host, charming, attentive, engaging her in conversation, drawing her out, making her feel almost at ease. He spoke of art, of music, of literature, topics far removed from the violence and betrayal that defined their world. He revealed a depth of knowledge, a sensitivity that surprised her, further dismantling the image of the ruthless Benedetti heir. But beneath the surface of civility, the tension remained. Livia was acutely aware of the guards patrolling the grounds, of the ever-present threat that loomed beyond the villa's walls. And she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, assessed, judged. As they ate, Livia studied Raphael, searching for any cracks in his armor, any hint of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. She noticed the subtle nuances of his behavior, the way his eyes flickered to the windows, the way his hand occasionally rested on the small of his back, where she knew he carried a concealed weapon. He was a man constantly on guard, constantly aware of the dangers that surrounded him. But she also saw something else, something that intrigued and unsettled her. She saw a weariness, a loneliness, a longing for something more than the life he had been born into. During a lull in the conversation, Livia decided to broach the subject of Isabella Conti. "You mentioned Isabella," she said, her voice casual, her gaze fixed on her plate. "You seem uncertain about her." Raphael's expression tightened slightly, his eyes darkening for a moment. "Isabella is complicated," he said, his voice guarded. "She's been a part of my life for a long time, but there are things I don't know about her." "Do you trust her?" Livia asked, her voice direct, her gaze meeting his. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "I don't trust anyone completely, Livia," he said, his voice low and serious. "Not in our world. But Isabella has always been loyal to me." "Loyal or opportunistic?" Livia pressed, her intuition screaming at her that Isabella was more than just a mistress, that she played a deeper, more dangerous game. Raphael's jaw clenched, his hand tightening into a fist. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I intend to find out." He revealed that he had been subtly investigating Isabella, monitoring her movements, her communications, searching for any evidence of her involvement with the Morettas, with the traitor. He had discovered some irregularities, some unexplained meetings, some coded messages that raised his suspicions. "I'm close, Livia," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of determination and apprehension. "I'm close to uncovering the truth." As they continued to talk, Livia felt a shift in their dynamic. The power imbalance, the protector-captor dynamic, began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of partnership, of shared purpose. They were working together, sharing information, strategizing, their minds aligned in a common goal. But the danger remained, the ever-present threat of betrayal, of violence. And Livia knew that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous their situation would become. Later that evening, after the chef had cleared the table and the guards had taken their positions for the night, Raphael and Livia found themselves alone in the villa's library, a vast room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fireplace crackling merrily, and the scent of old leather and aged paper. Raphael poured them both a glass of brandy, the amber liquid glowing in the firelight. He handed one to Livia, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a familiar jolt of awareness through her. They sat in comfortable armchairs near the fireplace, the silence between them comfortable, not strained. Livia felt a sense of peace, of connection, that she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, her gaze meeting his. "For everything." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, softening his features, making him look younger, less burdened. "You don't need to thank me, Livia," he said, his voice low and resonant. "I'm doing what I need to do. To protect you. To protect us." The word us hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the promise of a future that was still uncertain, still fragile. He leaned closer, his gaze intense, his breath warm against her skin. He began, his voice hesitant, his eyes searching hers. But before he could finish the sentence, a sudden noise from outside shattered the quiet intimacy. A shout, a gunshot, the sound of breaking glass. Raphael's body tensed, his hand instantly moving to the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. He pushed Livia behind him, shielding her with his body. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Don't move." He slipped out of the room, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Livia alone, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. The cracks in his armor were showing, and those cracks also revealed just how much danger they were in. The illusion of safety was starting to crumble, and, as she heard more sounds of fighting, she knew that their relative peace was at an end. Chapter 12. A night of stolen moments, shattered illusions. The sounds of chaos erupted from outside: shouts, gunshots, the shattering of glass, the thud of bodies. Livia remained frozen in place, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat. She was trapped, vulnerable, uncertain of what was happening, who was attacking, who was winning. She crept towards the library door, peering cautiously into the hallway. The villa, once a haven of peace and tranquility, had transformed into a battleground. Shadows flickered in the dim light, figures grappled in the darkness, the air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder. She saw one of Raphael's guards fall, his body slumping to the floor, a crimson stain blooming on his chest. She saw another exchange fire with an unseen assailant, the muzzle flashes illuminating the scene in brief, terrifying bursts. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be killed. She had to find Raphael, to help him, to fight alongside him. She slipped out of the library, moving silently along the hallway, staying close to the wall, using the shadows as cover. She had no weapon, no training, only her instincts and a desperate will to survive. She reached the main hall, the scene of a fierce struggle. Bodies lay scattered on the floor, furniture was overturned, paintings were slashed, the elegant decor reduced to a scene of carnage. She saw Raphael, his back to her, engaged in a hand-to-hand fight with a masked assailant. He was strong, agile, his movements fluid and deadly, but he was outnumbered. Two other attackers were closing in on him, their weapons drawn. Without thinking, Livia grabbed a heavy bronze sculpture from a nearby table, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. She rushed forward, screaming, swinging the sculpture with all her might. She struck one of the attackers on the back of the head, the force of the blow sending him crashing to the floor. The other assailant turned, his eyes widening in surprise, his weapon raised. But Raphael seized the opportunity, disarming the attacker with a swift, brutal movement, knocking him unconscious with a single blow. He turned to Livia, his face covered in sweat and blood, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and admiration. "Livia!" he exclaimed, his voice breathless, his chest heaving. "What are you doing?" "I told you to stay put." "I couldn't just stand there," she replied, her voice trembling, her body shaking with adrenaline. "I had to help." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb wiping away a streak of blood that had splattered on her face. "You saved my life," he said, his voice soft, almost tender. Their eyes met, a moment of shared vulnerability, of unspoken connection, amidst the chaos and violence. It was a moment of stolen intimacy, a brief respite from the storm that raged around them. He squeezed her hand. "We need to move, now." He grabbed her hand, pulling her along with him, moving quickly through the ravaged villa, searching for a way out. They reached a back door, leading to the gardens, the escape route Raphael had planned in case of such an emergency. But as they stepped outside, they were confronted by another attacker, a tall, muscular figure blocking their path. The figure raised a gun, pointing it directly at Raphael. "It's over, Benedetti," the attacker said, his voice muffled by a mask, but still familiar. Livia's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice, the stance, the subtle nuances of movement. It was Marco Rossi, Raphael's cousin, his trusted advisor. The traitor. Raphael pushed Livia behind him, shielding her with his body, his eyes locked on Marco, his expression a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. "Marco," he said, his voice low and tight. "What is the meaning of this?" Marco laughed, a cold, chilling sound that echoed through the night. "You were always so naive, Raphael," he said, his voice dripping with contempt.
"So trusting. So weak."
He revealed his plan, his ambition to seize control of the Benedetti Empire, to forge an alliance with the Morettas, to create a new order, a new power structure. He had been working with them all along, feeding them information, orchestrating the attacks, manipulating Raphael, using him as a pawn in his own game. As Marco spoke, Livia felt a surge of anger, of outrage, at his betrayal, at the pain he had caused, at the lives he had destroyed. Raphael stood his ground, refusing to give the satisfaction of seeing fear. "You always were a snake, Marco. I should have seen this, all of it coming." Marco laughed again. "You were too busy playing protector," with her he indicated, with a sneer, Livia, "to see what was right under your nose." The illusion had shattered. The carefully constructed facade of loyalty and trust had crumbled, revealing the ugly truth beneath. And as Marco raised his weapon, signaling the final, deadly blow, Livia knew that the night of stolen moments had come to a tragic, violent end. Chapter 13. The Unveiling of Bitter Truths. The air crackled with tension, the silence punctuated only by the soft patter of rain and the ragged breathing of the three figures locked in a deadly standoff. Marco Rossi, his face obscured by a mask, his eyes glinting with malice, held Raphael and Livia at gunpoint, his betrayal a gaping wound in the fabric of their already fractured world. "You were always a fool, Raphael," Marco spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Blindly trusting in outdated codes, in family loyalty. You were weak, soft, unfit to lead." Raphael stood tall, his body shielding Livia, his expression a mask of cold fury. He didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't plead. He simply met Marco's gaze, his eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal and a quiet, simmering rage. "You underestimate me, cousin," Raphael said, his voice low and dangerous. "You always have. And that will be your downfall." Marco laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the night. "My downfall? I think not. I hold all the cards, Raphael. The Morettas are backing me. The families are turning against you. Your empire is crumbling. And you're about to die." He gestured with the gun towards Livia. "And as for your little principessa," he sneered, "she's nothing but a pawn, a bargaining chip. A pretty trinket to be discarded when she's no longer useful." Livia felt a surge of anger, of defiance, at his words. She was not a pawn, not a trinket. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had endured unimaginable loss and betrayal. And she would not be intimidated, not by Marco, not by anyone. She stepped forward, partially out from behind Raphael's protective shield, her eyes locked on Marco's. "You're wrong," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. "I'm not a pawn, and I'm not afraid of you." Marco's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from arrogance to a flicker of surprise. Uncertainty? He hadn't expected her defiance, her courage. He had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated Raphael. "Brave words," Marco scoffed. "But they won't save you. They won't save either of you." He raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger, preparing to fire the fatal shot. But before he could pull the trigger, a figure emerged from the shadows, a silent, deadly force.
Isabella Conti.
She moved with a swiftness and agility that belied her elegant appearance. She disarmed Marco with a single, fluid motion, twisting his arm, forcing him to drop the gun. She then struck him with a series of precise blows, knocking him to the ground, rendering him unconscious. The sudden turn of events left Livia and Raphael stunned, speechless. Isabella, Raphael's mistress, the woman he had suspected of treachery, had saved their lives. Isabella stood over Marco's prone body, her expression cold, her eyes burning with a fierce intensity. She turned to Raphael, her gaze unwavering. "I told you I was loyal," she said, her voice low and tight. Raphael stared at her, his mind racing, trying to process the shocking revelation. He had misjudged her, doubted her, suspected her of the very betrayal she had just prevented. "Isabella," he said, his voice hoarse, his expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. I don't understand," she explained, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and pain. She had known about Marco's plot, his alliance with the Morettas, his plan to overthrow Raphael. She had been playing a dangerous game, gathering information, feeding Marco false leads, manipulating him, waiting for the right moment to strike. "I could never betray you, Raphael," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I love you." The confession hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. It was a truth that had been hidden beneath layers of deception, of suspicion, of unspoken desires. It was a truth that changed everything. Raphael looked down, then back up at Isabella. "And Marco?" She shook her head, a look of disgust clear. "He sought me out, believing the lies that you preferred a ghost to me, that you were besotted." Livia looked between the two, suddenly aware of a whole dynamic that had been completely invisible to her. Isabella continued, her voice softening. "I played along, gained his trust, waited for the moment to expose him. He thought I was the fool. The bitter truths had been unveiled. The traitor had been exposed, the betrayal avenged, the danger averted.
But the cost had been high.
Trust had been shattered, illusions had crumbled, and the future remained uncertain, a landscape of shifting alliances and unresolved emotions. The night held its breath, awaiting what was still to come. Chapter 14. Flight from the Gilded Cage. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the villa, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Marco's betrayal had exposed the vulnerability of their position, the extent of the network that sought to destroy them. Raphael decided they had to leave, to disappear, to regroup, and plan their next move. Isabella, surprisingly, proved to be a valuable ally. Her knowledge of the underworld, her network of contacts, her ability to navigate the shadows, were crucial to their escape. She arranged for a secure transport, a nondescript van that would blend into the night traffic, and a safe house, a remote farmhouse in the Umbrian countryside, far from the prying eyes of their enemies. Livia, still reeling from the night's events, felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease towards Isabella. She had saved their lives, proven her loyalty to Raphael, but the revelation of her love for him, the unspoken tension between them, created a new layer of complexity in their already fraught relationship. As they prepared to leave, Raphael took Livia aside, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his eyes searching hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, filled with concern. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "It's all so much." Marco Isabella the first, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tight. It was a gesture of comfort, of reassurance, of unspoken connection. "We'll get through this, Livia," he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "Together." But even as he held her, Livia felt a growing sense of unease, a nagging doubt that refused to be silenced. Isabella's presence, her unwavering loyalty to Raphael, her unveiled love for him, created a barrier, a wall between them. She felt like an outsider, a third wheel, a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. They left the villa under the cover of darkness, the van slipping silently through the deserted streets, heading towards an uncertain future. Livia sat in the back, huddled in a blanket, her mind racing, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and longing. She watched Raphael and Isabella, their hushed conversations, their shared glances, their unspoken understanding. They were a unit, a partnership forged in the crucible of danger and betrayal. And Livia felt excluded, isolated, uncertain of her place in their world. As they drove through the night, Livia made a decision. She couldn't stay with them. She couldn't continue to be a pawn in their game, a burden on their shoulders. She needed to find her own path, her own strength, her own way to survive. When they reached the safe house, a rustic farmhouse nestled amidst rolling hills and olive groves, Livia waited for her opportunity. While Raphael and Isabella were busy securing the perimeter, checking for any signs of surveillance, Livia slipped away, disappearing into the night. She left a note, a brief message of thanks and farewell. She didn't explain her reasons, didn't reveal her plans. She simply vanished, leaving behind the gilded cage, the complicated emotions, the uncertain future. She walked for hours, following a dirt road that wound its way through the countryside. She had no destination in mind, no plan, only a desperate need to escape, to be free, to find her own way. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky with hues of pink and orange, Livia reached a small village, a cluster of stone houses perched on a hilltop. She found a bus stop, a sign indicating a route to a nearby town. She had a little money, enough for a ticket, enough to start a new life, a new identity, far from the shadows of the mafia, far from the complicated entanglements of love and betrayal. She boarded the bus, her heart heavy with a mixture of regret and relief. She was leaving behind Raphael, the man who had protected her, the man she had grown to care for, the man she might even have loved. But she was also leaving behind the danger, the uncertainty, the constant fear that had defined her life for too long. As the bus pulled away, Livia looked back at the farmhouse, a small, insignificant speck in the vast landscape. She had made her choice, her escape, her flight from the gilded cage. And as she looked forward, she realized she had no regrets. The choice was, at least, hers. Chapter 15. The Hunted and the Hunter's Heart. Raphael awoke to an empty bed, the lingering scent of Livia's perfume a cruel reminder of her absence. Panic surged through him, a cold wave of dread washing over his carefully constructed composure. He found her note, the brief, impersonal message a sharp stab to his heart. Thank you for everything. I need to do this on my own.
Goodbye.
No explanation, no farewell, no hint of where she was going. Just a cold, decisive severance. He crumpled the note in his fist, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched in a mixture of anger, frustration, and fear. He had failed her. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe, and he had failed. He had allowed his own complicated emotions, his unresolved issues with Isabella, to cloud his judgment, to drive Livia away. Isabella found him standing by the window, staring out at the empty landscape, his body rigid with tension. She read the note, her expression shifting from surprise to a knowing sadness. She's gone, she said, her voice soft, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I know, Raphael replied, his voice hoarse, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own.
Why?
Isabella asked, her gaze searching his. Why would she leave? After everything, Raphael turned to face her, his expression a mixture of guilt and self-reproach. Because of me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Because of us. She felt excluded. Like a burden. Like a pawn. He explained his fears, his doubts, his inability to fully trust Livia, to fully commit to her, because of Isabella's presence, because of the unresolved emotions that lingered between them. Isabella listened, her expression shifting from sadness to a quiet understanding. She had known, deep down, that her presence created a barrier, a wall between Raphael and Livia. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that they could overcome it, that their love for Raphael could somehow coexist. You love her, Isabella said, her voice a statement, not a question. Raphael didn't deny it. He couldn't. He had fallen in love with Livia, with her strength, her resilience, her courage. He had found in her a connection, a hope for a future that he had never thought possible. "I have to find her," he said, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "I have to bring her back." Isabella nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "I'll help you," she said, her voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." They mobilized their resources, using their network of contacts, their surveillance capabilities, their influence, to track Livia's movements. They discovered her escape route, the bus she had taken, the town she had arrived in. Raphael was relentless, driven by a mixture of guilt, fear, and a desperate need to reclaim the woman he loved. He was the hunter, and Livia was the hunted, but it was a hunt fueled not by malice, but by a deep, abiding love. A love that was beginning to eclipse all reason. He tracked her to a small, coastal town, a picturesque village nestled between the mountains and the sea. He found her working in a small cafe, serving coffee and pastries to tourists, blending into the background, trying to create a new life, a new identity. He watched her from afar, observing her movements, her interactions with others, her quiet resilience. She looked different, stronger, more independent, more self-assured. She had found a sense of peace, a sense of purpose, that had been missing in the gilded cage. He hesitated, uncertain of how to approach her, how to explain himself, how to win her back. He knew he had hurt her, betrayed her trust, and he didn't know if she would ever forgive him. He continued to watch. She seemed happy, genuinely so. He had taken that from her, had, by the constraints of his life, denied it to her. And now, he wasn't so sure he had it in him to take it away again. He knew he needed to speak to her, needed to try. But for the first time in his life, the hunter was hesitating. Because he was starting to wonder if the greatest act of love was to let her go. He took a step back, disappearing into the shadows, the weight of his decision, his love, his loss, heavy on his heart. The hunt was over, but the chase, the ache in his heart, had just begun. Chapter 16. Reckoning with the Ghosts of the Past. Livia had found a semblance of peace in the small coastal town. The anonymity, the simplicity of her new life, the rhythm of the sea, had a calming effect, soothing the wounds of her past, allowing her to breathe freely, to begin to heal. She worked at the cafe, her days filled with the mundane tasks of serving customers, cleaning tables, making coffee. She found a small apartment overlooking the sea, its balcony offering a breathtaking view of the endless horizon. She made friends, casual acquaintances who knew nothing of her past, who accepted her for who she was, not for who she had been. But the ghosts of the past lingered, haunting her dreams, surfacing in unexpected moments, reminding her of the life she had left behind, the love she had abandoned. She thought of Raphael often, his image, his voice, his touch, a persistent presence in her mind. She wondered if he was searching for her, if he was angry, if he had moved on. She had moments of regret, of doubt, questioning her decision to leave, to sever the ties that bound them. But she knew, deep down, that it had been the right choice, the only choice. She needed to find her own strength, her own independence, her own path, free from the shadows of the mafia, free from the complicated entanglements of love and betrayal. One evening, as she was walking home from work, the setting sun painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, she saw a familiar figure standing on her balcony, his silhouette outlined against the vibrant colors. Raphael. Her heart leaped into her throat, a mixture of fear, excitement, and longing. She had known, deep down, that he would find her, that he wouldn't give up so easily. But she had hoped for more time, more distance, more healing. She approached the apartment cautiously, her steps hesitant, her mind racing. What would he say? What would he do? Would he try to force her to return? Would he be angry? Would he understand? He turned as she approached, his dark eyes searching hers, his expression a mixture of relief, regret, and something else. Something that looked like love. "Livia," he said, his voice soft, his tone gentle, devoid of the usual command, the underlying threat. "Raphael," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. They stood there for a moment, facing each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared past, their uncertain future. I had to see you, he said, his voice breaking slightly, his gaze unwavering.
Why?
She asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out, but he didn't touch her. He respected the space, the distance she had created between them. Because I made a mistake, he said, his voice filled with a raw honesty that surprised her. Because I let you go. Because I love you. The words hung in the air, a confession, a plea, a promise. It was the truth, unvarnished and vulnerable, a truth that shattered the remaining barriers between them. Livia felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of relief, joy, and forgiveness. She had longed to hear those words, to know that he felt the same way, that their connection had been real, not just a product of their dangerous circumstances. I love you too, Raphael, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, tears welling up in her eyes. He closed the distance between them, pulling her into his arms, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. It was an embrace of reunion, of reconciliation, of a love that had endured betrayal, distance, and the shadows of their past. I'm sorry, Livia, he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair.
For everything.
For not trusting you, for letting my own issues get in the way, for making you feel like you had to run. He explained his decision to let her go, his realization that he had been holding her back, that he had been trying to control her, to protect her, instead of allowing her to find her own strength, her own path. He told her about Isabella, about his decision to end their relationship, to sever the ties that had bound him to a life he no longer wanted. He had made a choice, a commitment to Livia, to a future free from the shadows of the past. They talked for hours, sharing their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They reckoned with the ghosts of their past, confronting the betrayals, the losses, the mistakes they had made. They laid bare their souls, their vulnerabilities, their deepest desires. As the night deepened, they found a new understanding, a new connection, a new foundation for their love. It was a love forged not in the crucible of danger and betrayal, but in the quiet strength of forgiveness, of acceptance, of a shared commitment to a future free from the shadows of their past.
He looked out at the night sky.
I will not be my father, Livia. And you will never be a prisoner again. I swear it. And she knew. She looked into his eyes, and all the doubts faded. She knew. They had both been running. But here, now, together, they were finally free. Chapter 17. Blood ties and broken chains. The decision to leave the mafia life behind was easier said than done. The Benedetti name carried weight, a legacy of power and violence that couldn't be simply shed like an old coat. There were obligations, expectations, enemies who wouldn't let Raphael walk away without a fight. He knew he had to sever ties with his family, with the organization he had inherited, with the world that had defined him since birth. He had to dismantle the empire, to distribute the assets, to negotiate a truce with rival families, to ensure Livia's safety and his own. It was a daunting task, a dangerous undertaking, fraught with risk and uncertainty. But he was determined, driven by his love for Livia, by his desire for a new life, a future free from the shadows of his past. He started by reaching out to his most trusted advisors, the men who had been loyal to him, who understood his vision, who shared his desire for change. He explained his decision, his reasons, his plans for the future. Some were skeptical, some were resistant, some were outright hostile. They had grown accustomed to the power, the wealth, the influence that came with being a Benedetti. They couldn't understand why Raphael would willingly abandon it all for a woman, for a life of normalcy. But Raphael was resolute, unwavering in his commitment. He used his authority, his influence, his remaining power to persuade, to cajole, to threaten, to ensure their cooperation. He began to dismantle the empire, piece by piece. He sold off businesses, liquidated assets, transferred funds to offshore accounts, preparing for a new life, a clean slate. He negotiated with rival families, offering concessions, promising non-interference, seeking a peaceful resolution to the long-standing feuds that had defined their world. It was a delicate dance, a dangerous game of diplomacy and intimidation. He had to tread carefully, balancing his desire for peace with the need to protect himself, to protect Livia, from those who sought to exploit his perceived weakness. Livia, meanwhile, was struggling with her own transition. She had found a measure of peace in her anonymity, in her simple life, but she knew that Raphael's decision would inevitably draw her back into the world she had tried to escape. She was torn between her love for him, her desire to support him, and her fear of the dangers that still lurked, the enemies that still sought to harm them. She didn't want to return to the gilded cage, to the constant fear, to the violence that had defined her past. They talked, they argued, they wrestled with their conflicting desires, their fears, their hopes for the future. They sought a compromise, a way to balance their love for each other with their need for safety, for independence, for a life free from the shadows. They decided to leave Italy, to start anew in a different country, a place where the Benedetti name carried no weight, where they could build a new life, a new identity, free from the constraints of their past. But before they could leave, Raphael had one final task, one final reckoning. He had to confront his family, his remaining relatives, the ones who clung to the old ways, the ones who would never accept his decision, his betrayal of their legacy. He arranged a meeting, a gathering of the clan, at a neutral location, a heavily guarded villa outside Rome. He knew it was a risk, a potential trap, but he had to face them, to make his intentions clear, to sever the ties that bound him to a life he no longer wanted. Livia insisted on accompanying him, despite his protests, despite the danger. She wanted to stand by his side, to support him, to show them that she was not a weakness, not a pawn, but a partner, an equal, a woman who would fight for her love, for her future. She knew, perhaps better than he did, that this life would never truly let them go. But together, she felt, perhaps they could weather what was to come. As they walked into the lion's den, the place was buzzing. But the whisper stopped as soon as they entered. All eyes were on them, a mixture of feelings emanating toward them, anger, curiosity, betrayal, judgment. And the confrontation that awaited, she knew, could define everything that came after. Chapter 18. The lioness bares her claws. The atmosphere in the villa was thick with tension, a palpable sense of hostility and resentment hanging in the air. The assembled members of the Benedetti clan, a mixture of older, traditional figures and younger, ambitious rivals, regarded Raphael and Livia with a mixture of suspicion, anger, and disdain. They were seated around a long, polished table, the same table where countless deals had been struck, alliances forged, and enemies vanquished. The faces were familiar, yet hardened by years of conflict, of power struggles, of ingrained loyalty to a code that Raphael was now rejecting. Leading the opposition was Zia Emilia, Raphael's aunt, a formidable woman with a sharp tongue and a ruthless ambition. She had always resented Raphael's ascension to power, believing that her own son, Carlo, was the rightful heir to the Benedetti Empire. Carlo sat beside her, his expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and barely concealed hostility. He had long coveted Raphael's position, and now, with Raphael's apparent weakness, his abandonment of their traditions, he saw an opportunity to seize control. Raphael began by outlining his decision, his reasons for leaving the mafia life, his desire for a future free from violence and betrayal. He spoke calmly, respectfully, but firmly, making it clear that his decision was final, irrevocable. His words were met with a barrage of criticism, accusations, and threats. Zia Emilia accused him of cowardice, of betraying their family, of abandoning their legacy. Carlo challenged his authority, questioning his sanity, suggesting that he had been bewitched by Livia, manipulated into making a foolish, irrational decision. The other members of the clan chimed in, their voices rising in a chorus of dissent, their faces contorted with anger and disbelief. They couldn't understand why Raphael would willingly relinquish the power, the wealth, the influence that they had fought so hard to achieve. Livia sat beside Raphael, her hand resting on his, her presence a silent source of strength. She listened to the accusations, the insults, the threats, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She had tried to escape this world, to build a new life, but these people, these blood ties, refused to let them go. When the barrage of criticism reached a fever pitch, Livia stood up, her eyes flashing with defiance, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "Enough!" she exclaimed, her voice silencing the room. "You speak of loyalty, of tradition, of family. But what have those things brought you? Violence, betrayal, death. You cling to a code that has destroyed lives, that has poisoned your souls." She addressed Zia Emilia directly, her gaze unwavering. "You call him a coward? He is the bravest man I know. He is choosing love. He is choosing peace. He is choosing a future free from the darkness that has consumed your lives." She turned to Carlo, her voice dripping with contempt. "And you? You covet his power, his position? You think you are worthy to lead? You are nothing but a snake, a traitor, a man who would betray his own family for personal gain." Her words struck a nerve, silencing the room, her unexpected outburst shifting the dynamic, disrupting the carefully constructed hierarchy of power. She had dared to challenge them, to speak the truth, to expose the hypocrisy and corruption that lay at the heart of their world. Zia Emilia rose to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "You dare speak to me like that?" she hissed. "You, an outsider, a nobody." But before she could finish the insult, Raphael intervened, his voice calm but firm. "She is my wife," he said, his gaze locking with his aunt's. "And she speaks for me. You will respect her, or you will answer to me." His words, his unwavering support for Livia, sent a clear message. He was choosing her, choosing their future, over the demands of his family, over the traditions of their past. The confrontation ended in a stalemate. The Benedetti clan was divided, fractured, their power weakened by Raphael's defection, by Livia's unexpected defiance. They couldn't stop him from leaving, from abandoning their world, but they could make his life difficult, dangerous. As Raphael and Livia left the villa, they knew they were walking away from a legacy of violence, of betrayal, of blood ties that had become chains. But they were also walking towards a future they would build together, a future free from the shadows of their past. The lioness had bared her claws, and the old guard had blinked. But the war, it was clear, was far from over. Chapter 19. A pact forged in fire and desperation. The escape from Italy was a meticulously planned operation, a clandestine flight from a world that refused to release its grip. Raphael, with Isabella's unexpected assistance, arranged for false identities, forged passports, and a private jet that would whisk them away to a new continent, a new life. Isabella's involvement was a testament to her loyalty, her love for Raphael, and her acceptance of his decision, his commitment to Livia. She had put aside her own desires, her own heartbreak, to help them escape, to ensure their safety. It was a selfless act, a final sacrifice, a bittersweet farewell. Before they left, Raphael and Livia made a pact, a solemn vow to each other, to their future. They would leave behind the violence, the betrayal, the darkness of their past. They would build a new life, a life based on trust, on honesty, on love. They would create their own family, their own traditions, free from the constraints of the mafia, free from the blood ties that had become chains. They chose a remote island in the Caribbean, a place of turquoise waters, white sand beaches, and lush tropical vegetation. It was a paradise, a sanctuary, far from the reach of their enemies, far from the memories of their past. They purchased a secluded villa overlooking the sea, a haven of peace and tranquility. They adopted new names, new identities, blending into the local community, becoming just another couple seeking a quiet, peaceful life. But the past, like a persistent shadow, refused to be completely erased. They received news of continued unrest in Italy, the fallout from Raphael's abdication, the power struggles within the Benedetti clan, the ongoing threat from rival families. Carlo, fueled by his ambition and his resentment, had seized control of the remnants of the Benedetti Empire, forging an uneasy alliance with the Morettis, vowing to avenge his cousin's betrayal, to hunt him down, to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. Raphael and Livia knew they could never truly be safe, that their enemies would always be lurking, waiting for an opportunity to strike. They lived with a constant awareness of the danger, a heightened sense of vigilance, a need to protect themselves, to protect their future. One evening, as they were sitting on their terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky with fiery hues of orange and red, they received a cryptic message, a coded warning from one of Raphael's former associates, a man who still held a flicker of loyalty to him. The serpent is on the move. He seeks the lioness.
Beware.
The message sent a chill down their spines. Carlo was coming for them. He had discovered their location, their new identities, and he was planning an attack. Raphael and Livia knew they had to prepare, to defend themselves, to fight for their survival. They couldn't run anymore. They couldn't hide. They had to stand their ground, to confront their enemies, to protect the life they had built together. They transformed their peaceful villa into a fortress, installing security systems, acquiring weapons, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. They were a team, a partnership forged in fire and desperation, their love for each other their strongest weapon. They reached out to Isabella, their unlikely ally, their former rival, their friend. She had remained in Italy, monitoring the situation, gathering intelligence, waiting for an opportunity to help them. She provided them with crucial information, details about Carlo's plans, his movements, his allies. She was their eyes and ears in the underworld, their lifeline to a world they had tried to leave behind. Isabella informed them of a weakness in Carlo's newly formed alliances. An old rival of the Morettis, sidelined and bitter, could be an unexpected source of assistance. Reach out to Don Antonio Greco. He has no love for Carlo or the Morettis. He may help, for the right price and the right revenge. Isabella's message ended abruptly. The pact they had made, the promise of a peaceful future, was about to be tested. The fire of their past was rekindling, threatening to consume them. But they were ready. They were united. They were determined to survive. And as they waited for the inevitable storm, their courage steeled them. This paradise would become their battleground. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The attack came at dawn, a swift, brutal assault on their island sanctuary. Carlo's men, a heavily armed force of mercenaries and loyalists, stormed the villa, their intentions clear: to kill Raphael, to capture Livia, to extinguish the last embers of the Benedetti rebellion. Raphael and Livia were prepared. They had anticipated the attack, fortified their defenses, and armed themselves with a combination of skill, courage, and a desperate will to survive. The villa, once a haven of peace, transformed into a battlefield. Gunfire echoed through the air, shattering the morning calm, the scent of gunpowder mingling with the salty breeze. Walls were riddled with bullets, windows shattered, furniture overturned, the elegant decor reduced to a scene of carnage. Raphael fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, his movements precise, his aim deadly. He had years of experience, a lifetime of training in the art of combat. He was protecting his wife, his future, his love. Livia, though initially terrified, fought with a surprising strength, a fierce determination fueled by her love for Raphael, by her refusal to be a victim, a pawn in their deadly game. She had learned from Raphael, trained with him, and she used her newfound skills with a deadly efficiency. They moved through the villa, a coordinated team, their movements synchronized, their communication unspoken. They covered each other, protected each other, fought for each other. It was a dance of death, a ballet of violence, a testament to their love, their loyalty, their unwavering commitment to each other. But Carlo's forces were overwhelming, their numbers relentless. Raphael and Livia were pushed back, cornered, their ammunition dwindling, their bodies bruised and battered. Just when it seemed that all hope was lost, a new force entered the fray. Don Antonio Greco, the rival mafia boss Isabella had contacted, arrived with his own men, a heavily armed contingent that turned the tide of the battle. Greco, motivated by a mixture of revenge and self-preservation, had decided to intervene, to eliminate Carlo, to weaken the Morettus, to seize an opportunity to expand his own power. The arrival of Greco's forces created chaos, a three-way battle that raged through the villa, the grounds, the surrounding jungle. The mercenaries, caught between two powerful enemies, were overwhelmed, their ranks decimated, their attack faltering. Carlo, seeing his plans unraveling, his ambition thwarted, his life on the line, confronted Raphael in a final, desperate showdown. They faced each other on the villa's terrace, overlooking the sea, the rising sun painting the sky with a dramatic backdrop of blood-red hues. "You can't escape your destiny, Raphael," Carlo sneered, his face contorted with hatred, his weapon raised. "You were born to lead, to rule. You can't run from who you are." Raphael stood his ground, his expression calm, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resolve. "I am not running," he said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. I am choosing love. I am choosing peace. I am choosing a future free from the darkness that has consumed your life." Carlo lunged forward, attacking Raphael with a savage fury. They grappled, wrestled, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle. The fight was brutal, a clash of wills, a battle for survival. Livia watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to intervene, to help Raphael, but she knew she had to trust him, to let him fight his own battle. It was Greco who intervened. He shot Carlo. Not to kill, that was not the plan, but to maim. Carlo fell, clutching his leg, howling in pain. Greco walked toward them, his men surrounding the scene. "Benedetti," he acknowledged Raphael with a nod. "We have an agreement." Raphael nodded back. "We do." Livia watched, stunned. The plan, it seemed, had been much more complex than she knew. Raphael stepped forward, offering his hand to help Carlo up. Carlo recoiled as if burned. Raphael spoke, softly. "You will leave Italy. You will never bother us again. Do this and you live. Refuse, and you know the consequences." Carlo, defeated, broken, his ambition shattered, had no choice. He accepted the terms, the exile, the end of his reign. The battle was over. The final confrontation had ended. Raphael and Livia had survived.
But the cost had been high.
Their sanctuary had been destroyed, their peace shattered, their future still uncertain. The final confrontation of hearts, however, happened when Greco left. And Isabella arrived. She had orchestrated it all. And now, she simply nodded at Livia and approached Raphael. "It is done," she stated simply. He nodded.
"It is."
She reached out and touched his cheek.
"Go.
Be happy." And then she was gone. The final threads severed. And only then did they realize they were truly free. Epilogue. 10 years later. The island had healed. The scars of the battle, both physical and emotional, had faded, replaced by a sense of peace, of resilience, of a love that had endured the ultimate test. Raphael and Livia had rebuilt their villa, transforming it into a true home, a sanctuary filled with laughter, with love, with the joyful sounds of their two children, a son and a daughter, who bore the names Alessandro and Isabella, a tribute to the past, a promise for the future. They had embraced their new identities, becoming integral members of the island community, known for their generosity, their kindness, their quiet strength. They had found a purpose beyond the shadows of their past, a life filled with simple pleasures, with the warmth of the sun, the beauty of the sea, the love of their family. They rarely spoke of the past, of the violence, the betrayal, the darkness they had escaped. But the memories lingered, a subtle undercurrent to their peaceful existence, a reminder of the fragility of life, the importance of cherishing every moment. They had received occasional news from Italy, snippets of information filtered through their remaining contacts, whispers of the ongoing power struggles, the shifting alliances, the inevitable cycle of violence that continued to plague the underworld. Carlo had vanished, disappearing into obscurity, his ambition thwarted, his dreams shattered. The Benedetti clan had splintered, weakened, their influence diminished. The Morettas had suffered a similar fate, their power curtailed, their empire crumbling. Isabella had remained in Italy, a silent guardian, a watchful protector, ensuring their continued safety, using her influence, her network of contacts, to keep the shadows at bay. She had never remarried, never found another love, her heart forever bound to Raphael, her loyalty unwavering. One day, a small package arrived, a simple wooden box containing a single, perfect white rose, its petals slightly unfurled, a drop of dew clinging to one of them. It was a message from Isabella, a reminder of their shared past, a symbol of enduring love, a silent farewell. Livia found Raphael standing on the terrace, overlooking the sea, the rose in his hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. He turned to her, his gaze searching hers, a silent question in his eyes. She smiled, a gentle, understanding smile, her heart filled with a love that had transcended betrayal, distance, and the shadows of their past. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, their bond unbreakable, their future secure. "She's watching over us," Livia said, her voice soft, her gaze meeting his. "Always." Raphael nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He knew that Isabella's love, her sacrifice, had made their new life possible. He knew that her presence, though distant, would always be a part of their story, a silent guardian angel watching over them. They stood there together, husband and wife, parents, survivors, their hands clasped, their hearts united, the setting sun painting the sky with a breathtaking panorama of colors. They had found their peace, their freedom, their happily ever after, a love that had conquered all, a future built on the ashes of their past. They were home. They were free. And they were, finally, at peace. Their children came running to them, innocent to the scars of the past. And as the family embraced, the future, finally, felt full of light.